guys, it's Regan and welcome back to another video. Today's topic I am so excited about because it combines honestly my two favorite things, and that is fantasy and romance. That's right, I have compiled some recommendations featuring some fantasy novels that either have a primary and central romantic plotline, basically like the main point of the book is to be a romance with fantasy, or some of my favorite fantasy stories that have what I think are some fantastic secondary romantic plot lines that I just love so very much. Honestly, this is a video I feel like I could make 3 times over, so if you enjoy this, definitely expect to see another one of these in the future. With that in mind, I also didn't include some very obvious titles, thinking Cassandra Clare or some very popular Sarah J Maas series. That being said, if you haven't checked those out, I would of course recommend them. But anyway, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. First book I have to recommend, I honestly think is the perfect example of a series that has so many fantastic things going for it, from the setting to the magic to the politics, and it also just happens to have some wonderful romantic subplot lines as well. It's basically, in my opinion, the total package when it comes to a fantasy book, and that is the Davabad series by S.A. Chakraborty, the first book being The City of Brass. This series truly has some of the most dynamic and fascinating characters and some of the most complicated and heart-wrenching political plot lines, but obviously with such a wonderfully built character-focused political fantasy, you're also going to get some heart-wrenching romance in there as well, and S.A. Chakraborty, in my opinion, writes it very, very well. And in the story, we basically open up to our main character Nahari. It's set in the 1800s in Cairo, and we follow her as she is a thief to basically make ends meet. However, one day she kind of steals the wrong thing, and she accidentally unleashes a trapped jinn warrior named Dara. And from there, Dara sweeps Nahari away to a faraway and very magical city of Davabad, and she also discovers that her family history has connections to not only a specific magical ability, but also was once very central to the politics within the city. This is a multi-POV tale, and I really cannot emphasize how political it is. You're following different characters on all sides of a very complicated and painful conflict between different religions and people that have been going on for thousands of years. Nahari is quickly thrown into the center of this conflict, and it's not something that can be solved overnight or within one book. Throughout the series, you go through multiple time skips, and it's also not as straightforward as it seems. You'll pick this first book up, and you might think you know what I mean when it comes to the romance, but I promise the story, the politics, and everything really expands in unexpected ways. And I just love the characters within this series so, so much. So of course that means I care very much about their hearts and the love that they feel as well. S.A. Chakraborty just writes so emotionally. This is a fantastic series with so many characters to root for, and I love it so much. It's one of my favorite series of all time. And it also wonderfully has a fantastic romantic subplot line as well. Next up, I actually have a fantasy standalone romance option, which I do feel like is a bit rare within the genre, and that is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. I love this book, again, for so many different reasons, including the romance. From the writing style is absolutely captivating and enchanting, to the historical setting, and the fact that you're following different points of views of girls in different social standings within this historical time. And it's also blurbed by Robin Hobb, which I feel like is just a little extra selling point for you guys. But this book is a historical fantasy story that is also a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. One of the points of views we follow is Miriam, and she is the daughter of a moneylender. And unfortunately, not only for their family's occupation, but also her family's religion, they are very much ostracized in town and within the country she lives in. Not to mention her father is very kind and frankly not the best moneylender, so her family is very much in debt. So she decides to take up the profession for herself to try to save her family, and also makes an unexpected deal with a magical individual. And that is, if she can turn silver into gold, she's able to kind of escape her fate. And in this story, we follow Miriam as she tries to weave her own fate and capture her own destiny, and sort of this back and forth between herself and this magical figure definitely is very central to the story, and oh my gosh, it is so, so good. And the other main perspective we follow is Irina, whose father has grand plans for her politically, and that is to marry her off to get closer to the Tsar. Unfortunately, her family and her father views her as not very important because she is not traditionally beautiful. However, her father will pay any price to achieve his goal, and as Irina begins to meet with the Tsar, she quickly realizes that he is not not what he seems. Both Miriam and Irina are kind of going on their own solo personal journeys of trying to basically take back their lives for themselves. So much of the story not only is inspired by fairy tales, very much influenced by the historical time period and setting that this book is set in. So much of the story is just so richly constructed. I cannot speak better things about just everything about it, from the romance to the writing to the characters to the setting. Again, it is a standalone as well, so it's a wonderful book to pick up and just fly through, and then you don't have the pressure of reading books 2 and 3 in a new series. So Spinning Silver, one of my favorite books, one of my favorite romances. It's just enchanting and magical. I could not do a video on this topic if I didn't include at least one Sarah J. Maas book. I decided to include Crescent City, which is the first book to a new urban fantasy series by Sarah J. Maas, with the second book coming out, I want to say early next year. I read this with pretty low expectations when it came out, and honestly, I really enjoyed it. It has all of the trappings of a very romance-forward urban fantasy story. I really want to emphasize that. The last 2 books I kind of recommended are very much fantasy stories with a central to strong like romance subplot line. This story is very much a steamy romance set in an urban fantasy story. But Sarah J. Maas also does a fantastic job kind of fleshing out the world and the magic, so it's also still incredibly entertaining and action-packed. I will say, I feel like Crescent City does a great job kind of defying your own expectations while reading this. I'll say, if you do pick this book up, read past the 75-page mark, because I hated the first like 75 to 100 pages of the story. I really thought I was going to DNF it, but there's definitely a very big plot shift that occurs early on in the story that to me completely transforms the overall reading experience and made it a lot more entertaining than I thought it was going to be. Bryce, in her opinion, lives the perfect life. She spends her days working in an archive at a job she generally likes and spends her nights partying with all of her best friends, until one night her entire life is turned upside down and now she finds herself in the middle of an investigation into a horrifying crime. Not only will she do anything to solve this crime, she will also do anything to get her revenge. Enter in our other main character, Hunt, who is a fallen archangel who's also kind of involved in the magical police force, and our 2 main characters basically link up to try to solve this crime that Bryce finds herself in the center of. The story itself takes place within Crescent City, which is honestly a very realized urban fantasy setting that Sarah J. Maas does a fantastic job kind of taking us through and explaining. It's a very cool like urban fantasy setting with different sections of the city controlled by different magical creatures, and each section also has its own kind of government and structure at play. There's magical artifacts as well as power plays happening between the different divisions, and all of this is seen through the eyes of a very fast-paced investigation as well as a very steamy will they, won't they, I hate you, I love you romance that's very much at the center of the story. Again, I just found this book incredibly entertaining. It was a page turner, which again you sort of expect with Sarah J. Maas. It was a lot of fun, and I'm personally really looking forward to the second book coming out next year. I love urban fantasy stories with romance. Just one of the best settings for a romantic plotline in my personal opinion. Speaking of urban fantasy, I also have Jade City by Fonda Lee. This is definitely more of an action-packed, incredibly political and intense urban fantasy story that honestly just has really well written and steamy romantic subplot lines. Jade City is by no means a romance story by any stretch of the imagination, but you do follow so many different character point of views, and there are romantic subplot lines that are just so well written and steamy that you just can't help but appreciate it. Like Fonda Lee's like, don't worry, I got you on the combat, on the martial arts, on the political backstabbing, and I'm gonna throw in a few good romantic scenes for you as well. So again, this is just more of an instance of Jade City has it all. But if you're not familiar, the Greenbone Saga is set in the fictional island of Kekon, and here there's a powerful substance called jade, which if you wear, you're basically stronger, faster, better than everyone else around you, but only certain people can actually harness the power of jade. And the production and distribution of jade is controlled by 2 major crime families in the area. In the Greenbone Saga, you're basically reading different points of views of one single crime family, and you kind of follow characters at different positions within this organization, and you also have different interests and goals within the organization as well. There's lots of family melodrama and backstabbing and action as the turf war between these two families also begins to heat up. It's so good. I feel like a video very rarely goes by when I don't talk about this series, but I felt like I had to include it in the fantasy romance video because I'm telling you, this book has some very solid, steamy romantic scenes, and I feel like a lot of people would agree with me. So anyway, that's all to say, read Jade City, please. Next up, I have a few YA options that are some of my all-time favorites, especially for their romantic plot lines. First up, we have a very underrated series that will have you absolutely sobbing your eyes out, and that is the Luma Chronicles by Melina Marchetta. This is a YA fantasy trilogy, and I would say Melina Marchetta is more known for her contemporary stories, and her ability to write relatable and heartbreaking characters really shines within this trilogy. The other thing I will say about this series is that each book actually follows a different main character point of view. Throughout the trilogy, you're basically following a variety of different heartbreaking and emotional romantic plot lines that will stay with you for forever. I have read this series so long ago and still think about all of these characters to this day. It's just so emotional, and just the connection and the heartbreak present within the story is just exceptional. I'm gonna go into the synopsis now, but I feel like it doesn't do what I'm trying to describe the series provides justice, and that is so many fantastic characters that you follow through a large expanse of time that you will just want to bleed for. They're amazing, and just the journeys they go on as individual characters, and also seeing them fight for what they want and their own love and their own lives is just extraordinary, and will just, I promise, it'll break you down. The first book, in my opinion, kind of acts as a prequel to the last two books within this trilogy, but it primarily follows our main character Finnegan, and he is from the land of Luma. And basically 10 years before the start of this novel, an imposter murders off the royal family and also sets upon a curse on the land, trapping a part of the populace within the borders of the land itself, unable to leave, and also trapping another part of the populace outside, forced to roam as refugees in other lands forever. At the beginning of the story, Finnegan is basically approached by a young woman who is a novice, telling him that the prince of this lost royal family is actually alive, and he now must go on a quest with her to reunite and possibly help lead their people home and break this curse. But as he begins this journey, he begins to realize that this young woman, this novice, might be actually holding some secrets back. This story is just so good. It's about generational conflict and the search for home and belonging. It's emotional, I'm telling you. It also has some of the best romances in YA you will find. It's just excellent. Next up, I also have A Song of Wraiths and Brun by Roseanne A. Brown, and the sequel to this just recently came out, so you're able to marathon this duology if you're interested. And this YA series has one of my personal favorite tropes, and that is hate to love romance, and even more than that, like two fated individuals who really do like each other, but for a variety of very complicated circumstances also kind of have to kill each other. It's so good, and it creates a lot of dramatic scenes and a lot of tension that I just love very, very much. This is a dual POV story, and one of those characters is Malik, and he is seeking to start a new life with his sister in the prosperous town of Zyron after they both fled their war-torn hometown. However, upon their arrival, Malik's little sister is kidnapped by a desert spirit, and to get his younger sister back, he strikes an impossible deal, and that is to kill off the crown princess of Zyron to save his little sister Nadia. And of course, the second POV we follow is Karina, the crown princess herself, who is facing an incredibly difficult political situation on the opening of this book. Her mother, the previous ruler, has just been assassinated, and she quickly realizes that the court that surrounds her is threatening mutiny, and she doesn't know who to trust. So she decides to pursue the only thing that she feels like will save her from this dire political situation, and that is to try to resurrect her mother using ancient magic, which requires the beating heart of a king. The only way to obtain this heart is to marry the winner of the upcoming solstice competition, which Malik himself has just enrolled into. And as you can see, the fates of these two characters are on a collision course to collide in so many different and dramatic ways throughout this first book. It's just so intense and dramatic, and Malik and Karina are two fantastic characters. You love reading from their points of view so much, and as their storylines begin to intersect more and more, the plot of this book gets out of hand completely. I personally cannot wait to check out the second book, which again just recently came out, but it also makes it perfect timing to pick up this fantastic first book to the duology, which also has a very intense and dramatic romantic plotline. And the last YA book I'm going to recommend is An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Here. This is another dual POV fantasy story that has a very intense plot and a lot of politics and a lot of action, but of course has a really dramatic and angsty will they won't they romance at the heart of the story as well. I do feel like was drawn out very successfully across the 4 books of this series. I do feel like romance pacing can be a little bit difficult within a series, but I do feel like Sabaa here did a fantastic job kind of spacing everything out, making sure the romance and all of the sub-romances as well were entertaining throughout all of these books, which made it just a page turner and honestly very fun to read. But this is a Roman military inspired story. One of our main characters is Leia, and she is part of the scholar group who has been subjugated by the current military power. At the beginning of this book, her brother, who was kind of working as a rebel, was arrested, and she makes a deal with the rebel group that if she basically becomes a spy for them, they will work to try to break him out of prison. And of course, the other main character we follow is Ellis, and he is a very powerful soldier at a very elite military school. Their fates and lives begin to intertwine, and I assure you, the politics really grow quite a bit from there. The story actually explodes quite dramatically from a political aspect, which does make it incredibly enjoyable, but I would say the real draw of the story is the romance between the 2 main characters, as well as the expansion of the magic, and the introduction of some other fantastic side characters. I think the multi-POV aspect of the story really does it justice as well. It allows us to get into the heads of not only our 2 main characters, but as the story expands, other characters as well. It's just a really fun, action-packed YA series with a fantastic, sizzling romance that will carry you through all 4 books. And the very last book I'm going to talk about is the perfect, like, vampire angsty fantasy moment, if that is what you're looking for. That is A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. This is a very over-the-top romance story between a witch and a vampire, set in a very academic and also incredibly pretentious Oxford setting, which honestly provides a wonderful ambiance to this overall romantic story. In this story, we follow our main character Diana, who is a witch but also a scholar and is currently working at Oxford on her research. And in the beginning of the story, she's in the library basically doing a bunch of analysis on a variety of manuscripts as she focuses on like archival history, and she basically calls for a specific manuscript that hasn't been able to have been called for hundreds of years, which kind of sets the spark on a variety of magical conflicts within this world. Something to note as well is that Diana is a witch, and there's also demons and vampires that exist, but these different magical creatures don't really interact with each other. They're supposed to basically lay low in the human world, and to do that, they basically have a pact where they don't really hang out with the other magical species, if that makes sense. But at the beginning of the story, Diana, of course, runs into Matthew, a very old, a very powerful vampire who also happens to be teaching at Oxford, and their love story begins from there, and a bunch of dramatic political things also begin to explode. I honestly really enjoyed reading this book for a variety of reasons. One, the incredibly dramatic, over-the-top, angsty relationship between Diana and Matthew was just really fun to read. Like, it's definitely one you have to suspend your disbelief because they're also incredibly annoying, but at the same time, it's just so hard to put down. I also loved the academic setting, and the author herself is a historian, so you could really see the care and thought she took into writing the setting, but also focusing on Diana's research and how she works and functions within the archive. I thought that was a really cool aspect of the story, and the historical aspect is actually fleshed out even further in later books in the series, which I think is a really cool element. I will say I do feel like this has a dark and brooding atmosphere, which does provide a lot of fantastic ambiance for a witch vampire romance story, and just so much angst. In some ways, this book is kind of like Twilight at Oxford, but I do appreciate how it has a lot more emphasis on magic and history and legacy, especially as Diana has to unpack her own family power. Has been a mystery to her since her own parents were murdered many years before. This book will definitely have you flipping the pages. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how angsty this is, but I do feel like it has a really fun backdrop that makes all of it work quite successfully. If you're looking for a very dramatic kind of urban fantasy romance story set in our world and our time, this is a good one to check out. Alrighty guys, those are some of my favorite fantasy novels with some romantic plot lines. Let me know down below some of your favorite fantasy romance novels because I would love to know, and I'm constantly adding them to my TBR, so please hit me with some recommendations. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye!